Greetings from Mesa View United Methodist Church of Albuquerque, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. Our traditional service is at 8:30 a.m. and at 11 a.m. we gather for contemporary worship. More information may be found at our website, mesaviewumc.com. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
And our gospel reading this morning is from Mark, chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to each other, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" Then they looked up. They saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side. And they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed, for you are looking for Jesus from Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
If you've not already been using the blue scripture insert, I invite you to take it out. On the back of that is a place to write things to remember from today's service, and you can make use of that during today's message. 3 men died, and they make their way up to heaven, and they're standing at the pearly gates. And St. Peter approaches them and says, "You can enter into heaven as long as you can answer one simple question. What is Easter?" The first man says, "Oh, that's really easy. That's that holiday we celebrate in November when we give thanks to God for all that's given for us. We eat a lot of turkey and watch football, and we gather with family." And St. Peter sort of shakes his head in disgust and goes to the next man. He says, "What is Easter?" The second man says, "I got this one. That's that holiday we celebrate in December. We put up trees and lots of lights and we exchange presents. We celebrate Jesus' birth." St. Peter shakes his head in disgust. He goes to the third man and says, "What is Easter?" The third man says, "Okay, that's that holiday we celebrate in the spring. It coincides with the Jewish Passover. Remember Jesus going to Jerusalem for the Passover, being betrayed and arrested and tried and crucified, and he died, and they put his body in a tomb, and so we gather on Sunday morning and we wait for Jesus to come out of the tomb, and if he sees his shadows, it's 6 more weeks of winter." The accounts that we get of Easter in the Gospel of Mark is rather brief. When we get to the end of the women fleeing in fear and not telling anyone, we might think that someone's playing a trick on us. It's an April Fool's joke. Isn't there supposed to be more to this story? Now, if you look in your Bible, you'll find some continuation there under the heading of either the shorter or longer ending of Mark. But our earliest and best manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark don't have those endings in them. That we believe that Mark ended it exactly there with the women fleeing from the tomb in fear and not telling anyone. And that later editors added in those different endings because they thought there has to be something more here. I mean, we have Matthew, Luke, and John both tell us much longer. Mark's Easter story is only 8 verses long, versus Matthew's is 22 verses. Luke's is 53 verses, and John has 55 verses. There must be something more to the story. After all, we know that the women told people because we're sitting here this morning. So they had to have not just ended with them running off in fear. So what happened? Why is that left off? And so we might ask that question today on April Fool's Day, the first time we've celebrated Easter on April Fool's Day since 1956. But Mark's gospel ending is intentionally brief, just as the rest of his gospel is intentionally brief. Now, did you hear that the world's tongue twister champion got arrested? I hear that the judge is going to give him a really hard sentence. The jokes don't get any better, just so you're aware. But Mark can tell us all that we need to know really in those brief 8 verses. And it starts with how the Easter story begins. In the Gospel of Mark, at the very beginning, it begins with Jesus going down to the Jordan River to be baptized by John the Baptist. And we're told that as Jesus comes up out of the water, the heavens part and the Spirit comes down upon him. And so we should instantly begin to think back to Genesis 1 of the creation story, of the waters parting and the Holy Spirit moving across the waters as an indication that Jesus is a beginning of something new. It's part of a new creation that God is bringing into the world. And that's confirmed here for us in the Easter story because we're told it's on the first day of the week that the women go to the tomb. And then to emphasize this point of this new beginning, Mark then says, after the sun has arisen. And what's the first thing that God does in the creation story? It says, let there be lights. And so as soon as the light comes up, the women go to the tomb, understanding that they're about to encounter this new creation, a new life, a new world that comes about because of this resurrection, although they have not yet seen it yet. What they also don't understand is that this really is the beginning of the best joke that God ever told the world. Because the religious and political authorities thought that they were getting rid of Jesus by having him killed. That's always worked in the past. You kill the leader and the movement ends. And if you kill the leader doesn't come back and cause more problems later. You killed him. Always worked in the past for them. But this time, it doesn't. They thought that they were in control. That if you kill the leader of a charismatic movement, that movement will disappear. And even if somebody's brave enough to stand up, they know that they too will be killed. That's the whole purpose of crucifixion, is to set an example. To say, if you cross Roman authorities, this will happen to you too. And so they believed that they were the ones in control. Take care of the leader and you solve the problem. But it turns out they're wrong, because God is in control. Paul declares in his first letter to the Corinthians, for the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved is the power of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. That seems an appropriate quote on April Fool's Day. That the powers of the world thought that violence and power were how strength was shown. And that giving yourself over to, in weakness, not even standing up for yourself, being a sacrifice, that's weakness. But God says that might work in your kingdom of power and strength and violence, but that's not how my kingdom works. You can think you can overcome me by killing Jesus, but I will overpower you by bringing him back to life. Strength out of weakness. Surprise! But it wasn't just a surprise to the leaders. Although the Bible does not say what Jesus did for the 3 days between his death and the resurrection, the tradition of the church holds, most commonly found in the ancient creedal statements, that Jesus either descended into hell or descended to the dead for those 3 days. Which means that either death, or more commonly Satan, thought that they had won, that they had control over Jesus, that he had died. And not only had died, but now he's in their kingdom. And they had beat God. And not only had they beat God, but now they have control over God. And yet it turns out, just like the Roman and political and religious authorities, they didn't win. And so the church has said that the greatest joke God ever played was to let Satan think that he had won. To let death think that it had won. That because of Jesus, God was able to overcome our slavery to sin and death, and to set us free from the powers and principalities of the world. Because God would win. That even when others thought that they could claim victory, that God would win. That they were wrong. That God's foolishness of using the cross and the resurrection overcame the wisdom of the world. One day Satan challenges Jesus to a duel. And because Satan is great in Microsoft products, which proves that Microsoft is evil, he says, I want to challenge you to a computer duel. And so Jesus says, okay. And so they sit down and they set the rules for what they have to do. And they engage in doing spreadsheets, and they're doing graphic design, they're doing internet research, they're doing genealogical research, they're sending off emails, making sure the attachments are actually attached, which is a problem I normally have. They're doing all this work, and suddenly there's lightning in the sky, and it starts pouring down, and the power goes out. And when the power comes back on, they turn the computers back on, and Satan starts screaming, it's gone, I lost everything. And Jesus begins printing out all of the work that he has done, because you know why? Jesus saves. And so we can see the joke that God played on those who thought they were in control. But what does that mean for us? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that takes us back to the women going to the tomb that day. And it's clear that they didn't go to the tomb expecting to find life, or expecting to find that Jesus had been raised from the dead, because they went out and bought spices so they could go and anoint the body. Because there hadn't been enough time from when Jesus was taken down on the cross on Friday to prepare the body for burial before the Sabbath began. And so they go to the tomb that morning expecting to find Jesus' body there. They didn't believe that when Jesus told them, I'll be raised in 3 days. They went expecting to find death. But it starts really with them wondering, who's going to roll this stone away? How are we even going to get into the tomb? We're not strong enough to be able to move this. And then we're told they look up, and the stone has been moved. In Matthew's gospel, Matthew says, who moves the stone? Mark doesn't give us that indication. Presumably, then it's God that's removed this barrier so they have access to the tomb. And that should leave us then thinking about obstacles we have in our lives. Those things that seem impossible to move or to let go of, those huge stones that stand in front of us, that keep us from getting to where we need to go. What are we going to do about those stones? More importantly, are we going to ask God to help move those stones? Are we expecting a miracle? Are we putting ourselves in the pathway for a miracle to happen? I got a card this week from a former member of Mesa who's moved away. But while she was here, she was involved in a terrible car accident and actually lost the use of one of her arms. And she told me that she believes that the prayers that we offered over her and her arm were what gave her the ability to actually use her arm today. And she told me she believes that the miracle happened because we believed that God would do something for her. But she also had to believe that as well. She had to put aside her own ideas, her own concerns, her own expectations of what was best for her, and say, I'm turning this over to you, God. And it didn't happen immediately. It took persistence. But it took the belief that God would move that stone out of her life. And that's what we see for the women at the tomb. Because in the Christian church, we believe that in baptism, that we die to our old selves, and we are reborn as children of God. That is, that we have to enter into the tomb in order to gain life. And so in ancient churches, baptismal fonts would often be in the shape of a cross, or sometimes a sarcophagus to sort of illustrate. And you would walk down into it, and then walk out the other side to illustrate dying to your old death, the old self, and being reborn into a new life. Now, baptismal fonts like this, ours is round, but normally they're 8-sided. And they're 8-sided, representing the 8th day of the week. 7 days of original creation, now the beginning of a new creation, the first day, the 8th day. A new beginning, a new creation that's given to us. And so the women see that the stone has been moved aside, and they enter into the tomb and are told that Christ is not there, and then leave the tomb again. They enter into death in order to exit into new life, a new reality, a new creation for the world. But God has overcome. And notice that in Mark's accounts, they don't see the risen Christ. They don't encounter Christ. All they have is the testimony of the young man who's there. And I think one of the reasons why Mark is one of my favorite Gospels is because that speaks strongly to us today. Because again, unless some of you have had an experience you have not told me about, none of us have encountered the risen Christ standing face to face with us. All we have is the testimony of people who said, like Peter, we saw him and we ate with him. All we have is a testimony of people saying, Christ has been risen. And so we are just like those women at the tomb on that first Easter on this day, of hearing the testimony that Christ is not here, he's been risen just as he said. And so what are we going to do about that? Are we going to believe in the resurrection? Are we going to believe and say, well, that's impossible, that's not even a joke I can begin to laugh at? Are we going to tell others about the testimony that we have received? Or are we going to run away in fear? That's the choice we encounter every Easter when we hear the story again that Christ is risen. But our hope is not found in our ability to be able to complete that story. Our hope is found in God and the work that God has already done, that God is doing, and that God will continue to do. And the work that God is calling us to do. That means that we are co-creators with God. That our laughter is God's laughter, and God's laughter is our laughter. And that we can celebrate the greatest joke that God ever told. And yet it's deeper than that, because it said that comedians don't say funny things. They say things funny. That is, what sets up a good joke is the unexpected punchline. And the punchline works because it's unexpected. And so Easter is the greatest punchline because it was totally unexpected by everyone. And it brought not only joy to the world, it brought joy to God. Because God's foolishness is greater than human wisdom. And so the 13th century Christian theologian and mystic Meister Eckhart said, the Father laughs at the Son, and the Son laughs at the Father, and the laughter brings forth pleasure, and the pleasure brings forth joy. And he described God's joy like a horse frolicking out in a meadow, kicking up its heels. And that joy, he says, brings forth love. The pleasure brings joy, and joy brings love. And of course, joy also brings laughter. Voltaire once said that the problem of the church is that God is a comedian who's playing to an audience that's afraid to laugh. And maybe that's fear. It causes us to be unable to laugh. But the angel says to the women, do not be afraid. Do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He was dead. But he's not here. He's been raised. So let us celebrate this day. Let us celebrate every day. Let us laugh with God. Because God has pulled the greatest prank that the world has ever known. The tomb was empty. God has won, because nothing is impossible with God. So let us go forth and laugh and proclaim the good news that Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Amen.